Hello and welcome to another edition of Mixing Light's Office Hours Live. We've got our members here in a conference call on Zoom. We've got Bram Desmet from Flanders Scientific. Hello, Bram.
Hello.
And then joining me today as a co-host for this meeting is Cullen Kelly from Los Angeles. Hello, Cullen.
Hi, everybody.
And then also joining us today is we are live streaming this meeting to YouTube. I think maybe they're waiting on a different live stream that's actually going on there. That's okay. We do this because Bram is a great friend, and we like to promote Mixing Light, but really this conversation is for our Mixing Light members to ask questions. I have several questions lined up from our members that we'll start with, and then as this progresses, we'll take questions and feedback from our members. If you're in the Zoom meeting and you have a question or you'd like to kind of jump into the conversation, use the raise your hand function here in Zoom, and then I'll work you in. If you submitted a question, we're using it. So everyone who submitted a question, we're going to use today. And so if you want to jump in at some point, I'll call you out as well, and we'll take it from there. So getting started, Bram, I thought what we would do is start a little bit in memory lane, because I guess I started with Flanders Scientific myself probably around 2008, 2009, I think is probably around right, maybe a little bit sooner. I remember my Sony PVM cathode ray tube monitor was dying.
Yeah.
And I was looking for a replacement. And even then, plasmas were the big thing, but they were going on out.
Yeah.
And, I was reading about this company called Flanders Scientific over on Creative Cow with Walter Biscardi was a big early proponent of Flanders Scientific. And so I talked to your dad very briefly, and then I think you and I talked on the phone for a while, and maybe even stopped by and brought one of your displays, one of your LCDs. And so my first impressions of LCD displays were formed by that early period.
Yeah.
And there was this big thing about 8-bit versus 10-bit. You had a true 10-bit display at the time, and there was 8-bit FRC. And there was this whole thing going on back then. And I guess so. My first question is, we are in 2022. We've got LCDs and we've got OLEDs, and then there are some new technologies coming forward. Could you kind of take us back a little bit, or maybe forward, and catch us up? Like if our first impressions were formed back in those days, how are the professional displays that a company like yours is producing and selling? How is there anything functionally different about them today versus 15 years ago?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for hosting this. I really appreciate it. And I remember that first meeting. Actually, I believe I came to you in New York or the New York area, and we did or started to do a demo, and was pulling the monitor out of the box, and we ended up talking about technology. And I think it took an hour of talking before I actually pulled the monitor out of the box, because we just got into the weeds on display technology. So yeah, we have a long history of this, and I appreciate that history. I think one of the kind of recurring trends in this industry that is honestly been frustrating is that technology always seems to go away. The prevalent technology of the day always seems to go away a little bit sooner than everybody's ready for, before the next big thing comes, right? So with CRTs, there were a lot of variables that were causing CRTs to go away. One of them was, things like the lead-free initiative in Europe, and then there was just form factor being all wrong for consumer television, where people wanted larger TVs, smaller TVs, flatter TVs, things that could be hung up on a wall. And so CRTs kind of went away before there was a great alternative. You saw a lot of people scrambling to make LCD monitors with what was available. And then you saw plasmas become prevalent, and plasmas were were good, but had their own issues. Loading behavior, burn-in were certainly issues on those. Low-end noise was an issue on those. If you sat too close to them, it could be really hard to figure out on a plasma. For those of you who used them back in the day, what was signal noise, actually recorded, and what was just the noise of the plasma display. But and then everybody kind of, we accepted plasmas as the technology of the day for larger format monitoring. And same story with those. They kind of went away before people were ready because they weren't profitable. Energy restrictions in certain markets kept them from being sold there. So this trend always continues, and that happened even with RGB OLEDs, right? So RGB OLEDs with Sony's semiconductor side of the business pulling out of those before people were ready. It meant that again, everybody was kind of scrambling for new technology. So what we've always tried to do is we've tried to use a variety of technologies using the best of what's available out on the market at any given time to address different needs, right? So we're not married to any one technology. We're not just the LCD company. We're not just the OLED company. We will try to find the best thing that's available, and we'll try to make something with those. So the early iterations of our products were typically fluorescent backlight. We had both narrower gamut fluorescent, like the EEFL backlights we used in some of our 17-inch monitors, and then the wider gamut CCFL panels that were unique in their time in that they were, actually quite early on. This was 2008, 2009, we already had displays that were essentially doing all of P3 color gamut already. So you had this wide gamut capability, but fluorescent backlights have their own issues. They tend to look a little different than a lot of other technologies. So there were metamerism issues even back then. Then you also had the issue of warm up. They could take quite a long time to warm up compared to some of the LED solutions that came later. You saw LED backlights become popular for a while there. To get wide gamut with LED early on, you had to use RGB LEDs, which proved difficult in terms of maintaining stability over time. So they tended to have a fair amount of color drift over time. They're also expensive to make. So, we had a challenge making those at an affordable price. And then from RGB LED, that kind of evolved to displays with, one of the things that we've seen in more recent years for LCDs is this KSF, otherwise sometimes known as a KSF. So that's essentially the backlight that's used in something like the DM240, DM241, some of our newer displays. And that's a fantastic technology at getting you very wide gamut with essentially what is really a white LED backlight. And that's been more or less the gold standard for static backlight LCD solutions. You see those types of backlight used in consumer devices, from Apple devices to, again, our own monitors. There are some issues with those trying to use them for modulated backlight setups. So, and in terms of getting to wider gamuts as well. So quantum dot is another thing you'll see a lot of now. So quantum dot equipped LCDs, typically in this day and age, using a QD film layer. And that enables wide gamut and also is better for modulated backlight design. So I think that's another thing you'll see is if you want modulated backlights, full array local dimming, you'll see that they are using typically, or the preference is going to be to use quantum dot based LCD solutions. And then RGB OLED was, again, top emission RGB OLEDs were quite popular for some time. We made a lot of great monitors with those. They left the market before we were ready for them to leave the market. I think everybody will agree with that. But simply, for those semiconductor manufacturers, it wasn't a profitable business. They couldn't scale into the markets they wanted to scale into with that technology. The yields weren't what they wanted them to be.
And this kind of gets us to what is a fundamental truth about your business in particular, which is you largely piggyback off the consumer market.
Yeah.
Because our market just isn't big enough for these big fabs to be built.
Yeah, and that's a key point to make is that if you're looking at the capital investment to start one of these factories, you're typically looking at well over $1 billion of capital investment. So people are always like, "Hey, why don't you start your own fab?" Well, because nobody's got that money to burn on a market where you literally, this is a market where, and people are sometimes surprised to hear how small it is, but it's something where if you have a good monitor solution that's extremely popular, you sell it in the thousands, not the, even tens of thousands is not the norm really. And some niche products will sell in the hundreds per year.
Yeah.
So this is definitely a niche market. Even the big players, you'll hear, stories of some of their premier like $35,000 monitors. They might sell a few hundred of those a year. So it is a small market, and that's why you have to piggyback on other markets. What I will say to that end is that something that we've done as of late, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll get this in because I think it's important, is that when the panels again went away before we were ready on the XM310K and XM311K, both of those were made by Panasonic LCD Display, and they decided to stop making panels altogether and pull out of the industry because it wasn't profitable. So when we were searching for a solution to replace those for HDR displays, we found a lot of kind of halfway there solutions, things that could get to 900 nits or maybe just 1,000 nits, but had other trade-offs. And we really want to push the industry forward. So we couldn't find anybody who offered an off-the-shelf solution, because typically that's what we'll do. We'll buy a panel with an integrated backlight, or we'll buy an OLED panel or whatever it is, and then we build a professional monitor around that. We couldn't find anybody who would offer something that was at least as bright as our outgoing 310K. So what we actually did is we found a panel supplier that was willing to work with us, and we designed the system from the ground up. So we took the front glass that already existed, but the entire backlight unit and everything that drives it was custom built by us from the ground up, and they agreed to essentially build these panels for us based on our own design. And that's how we were able to get something that could do 5,000 nits. Our goal was to get something that could at least do 4,000 nits, since 4,000 nits is a deliverable standard that exists at some facilities now. We wanted to make sure that we could build something to do that. So that was a little bit of a stretch for us, because it's not something that we've traditionally done, but I think it's been a worthwhile adventure for us, and it's also something that we took baby steps to do. And you've seen some of the knock-on benefits of our going down that direction, in that products like our kind of more entry-level products like the BM211 and BM241 last year were replacements for the BM210 and the BM240. So what we did is we took a lot of, because we were buying LEDs to make these custom backlight units, so we had a lot of experience all of a sudden binning LED elements and making sure we had very high quality LEDs. We actually built custom backlights even for those entry level units. Now those are not modulated, those are just static backlights, but we were able to go from something that could barely hit Rec 709 color gamut to now, even on our sub $3,000 entry level broadcast monitor that's intended for editorial and general QC type applications, that unit can do almost all of P3 color gamut. And that's because we've built those custom backlights for those units. So we are still beholden to the semiconductor industries at large to get panels, and especially the front glass. But where possible, we've gone that extra step and built very customized solutions to try to push the industry forward. We're not going to tell you that everybody needs a 5,000 nit monitor. We know that it's not something we expect to do in high volume. But if we don't push beyond 1,000 nits, what we see is that we're all getting kind of a little, in my opinion, too comfortable with saying 1,000 nits is good enough. We know that's what a lot of people require for deliverables, but there is real value if you compare a 5,000 nit monitor next to a 1,000 nit monitor in exploring those higher luminance levels, because the impact is very real. It's something you can see with your own eyes, and it is a compelling thing when you see it in person.
And Cullen, if you want to jump in here at any point, just go ahead and ask if you have any questions of Bram. The one thing I would say is I've noticed that in we get a lot of emails from members or just people who randomly hit the contact us page and saying, hey, is this XYZ display that's, $800. Can I use this for HDR? And, you take a look at the specs and it does, 400 nits
Yeah,
and all of that. And, it's hard to tell someone that, whether or not they should buy it, right?
yeah,
Whether or not it's right for them. And you have got to have a ton of these conversations yourself.
sure.
How do you handle that kind of question, and
Yeah.
how do you help guide people to decide what's the right amount of investment and what's the right type of display for you?
Yeah, I mean, we try not to oversell people on what their needs are. If you're a student starting out and you don't have a paying client, it's I've said it ad nauseum over the years, so excuse me for saying it again. But I think the point where there's some responsibility for a facility or a colorist or an editor for that matter to buy a relatively professional solution is when you have paying clients. Same thing with HDR. I think HDR is a really great example. There are a lot of halfway solutions. You can find these 500 nit OLED displays. You can find WOLEDs that might do 800, 900 nits, but they have volumetric issues in HDR. They're good enough maybe for client monitoring. They're good enough to get your feet wet, so to speak, in this HDR world. But if you're delivering something that's supposed to be mastered for HDR, you probably want to use one of these professional solutions that can really hit all the minimum benchmarks. And so, there's a gradient there. We're not the solution for everybody in terms of, do you have to have this higher end solution? But we think that, if you want to see things correctly, if you want accurate, stable color, if you want to be able to hit certain benchmarks for certain deliverables, that's what we try to address. It's also why we don't chase certain solutions maybe as aggressively as some of our competition. There are some kind of low hanging fruit type things that are, would be easy to sell. Like, we have what I've seen, and not to call out names for companies, but I've seen 300 nit capable OLED monitors being marketed as HDR, and we just won't do
Yeah.
that. That's not our business. We might say it has an HDR monitoring or an HDR preview mode, but we always qualify those things and try to be very straightforward with people and not oversell the technology. And I think you'll see that especially like in our WOLED offerings, the XM551U and the XM651U. We really say those are SDR mastering solutions, and we say there's an HDR monitoring offering or mode on those. But if someone comes to me says I want to master on this, we'll usually try to steer them towards something else. But yeah, that's kind
And
of
in terms of, go, Colin, I think you had a question there.
Yeah, well, I was just curious if Bram could finally set me straight on something that I am a little embarrassed to admit I don't really get. I know the sort of like stock talking point that there's issues with HDR and WOLED and
Sure.
volumetric issues. I can kind of repeat that to you if you ask
Yeah.
me about them.
Yeah.
That's about like if you ask me to, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more.
Yeah.
I'd go like, hang on, I'll be right back, and I'd probably
Yeah.
like try to get you on the phone or something. So I wonder if you could like give us the TLDR, like the brief, a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
Like what does it mean?
So the simple kind of premise is that most displays are RGB additive for white, right? So if you add up the red, green, and blue channels, you'll get what that white channel is outputting. WOLEDs are not, because they have a separate white drive. So you essentially have four subpixels. One is a white OLED material that they're all driven by white, and then there's actually layers of filters over it, kind of like an LCD. But one of those four has no filter essentially, so that white gives you a boost. What's neat about that is that you can hit high peak white. So if you have things that are on or near the white axis, you might be able to get 800, 900 something nits on some of these displays. The problem is that because it's not additive, as soon as you stop using that white as much, you get out into the edges of bright saturated colors, you can't hit those. So for example, normally on like a 900 nit display, you might be able to expect that you'll hit a high 600 nit or so bright saturated green, but on a WOLED, that might be more in the 200 something nit range. And
Nice.
so that's the fundamental problem. And why WOLED still works as a consumer solution is because with tone mapping and also with the way that a lot of HDR appears to you, you can still get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak, on those displays by having that chrome reflect back at you. Because guess what? It's kind of near that white
Achromatic.
axis, right? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
achromatic. So, but the issue is now let's do a nighttime scene of Vegas and all the neon lights there. Well, guess what? If you put that next to a display that can do HDR perfectly correctly up to 1,000 nits or whatever, you're going to see that those greens look much brighter. And because that luminance and saturation perception to the viewer are tied together, that brighter also looks more colorful to you, right? So you have just an image that looks dull by comparison if you see it. And a really good example of this, and you have to be careful because on the consumer side, there's post-processing stuff that can mess up kind of fair comparisons. But if you do a fair comparison of a newer technology like QD-OLED, which does not have that volumetric collapse, versus WOLED, it is really compelling. You can see the difference. Now, it doesn't mean WOLED's not good for certain things, and certainly I have two of them at home as my HDR consumer TVs. But for mastering applications, this volumetric collapse is a very real thing, and you just have to be mindful of it because your tendency is going to be to compensate for that in the grading suite, right? Because you have this volumetric collapse. So you might overcook something and then you see it on a display that's correct and you see that, oh my goodness, that green is now 400 nits brighter than I thought it was going to be.
So you're saying in that luminance range, essentially the gamut response is insufficient.
Correct. So you have one of two things can happen, right? So you can either make that green as saturated as it needs to be, and then it's going to be a lot dimmer, or you can desaturate the green towards gray, and then you'll get something that loses color that way. But either way, they volumetrically do not track appropriately for an HDR mastering environment. Again, you can get a great HDR kind of effect, especially in a consumer world.
Right.
But for mastering, if you're talking about accuracy, it's not accurate.
You're not seeing your image fully.
Correct.
Thanks so much. That makes so much sense.
No problem.
Yeah, and Bram, along those lines, talk a little bit about, you were talking about benchmarks for HDR.
Sure.
And so one of those benchmarks, of course, is Rec 2020. Sure. And so you'll get people, I'll see comments about, well, that display doesn't do Rec 2020. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about what displays out there do Rec 2020. and when we're talking HDR, what are actually the specs that we should really be looking at and understanding?
Sure. So I can sell you a Rec 2020 laser projector if you like, but in terms of flat panel displays, you're not going to find them. Again, if you look at some of the solutions out there, getting to 93% of Rec 2020 coverage, it depends on how you calculate it, but that's starting to be attainable. The fundamental issue with Rec 2020 is that the primaries lie on the spectral locus of that horseshoe CIE diagram you're all probably familiar with, and those are essentially single wavelength light emissions, right? So you get that with, if you define what a laser is, that's basically what a laser is, right? So Rec 2020 though is a useful container, right? And I think that's what we always have to go back to, is that the idea was to get a very large container to future-proof ourselves a little bit more. That being said, there are a lot of, if you're delivering to Netflix, they're asking for P3 color gamut deliverables, not 2020. The more important part is just making sure your grading suite is set up correctly so that you're outputting things defined as Rec 2020 code values or P3 code values, right? So if you say, give me whatever RGB triplet you want to do, well, RGB triplet relative to what? Relative to Rec 2020 or relative to P3? That's important not just for how far the saturation actually goes out, but also because those hues lie on different vectors, right? So you can have this kind of shift there. So that's the more important thing, is really to have support for the signals. There's, opinions are split on which the best workflow is, but the reality is that there are a lot of displays that can hit all or most of P3 whereas there aren't really any that can do Rec 2020. Now that's evolving. Again, I'll say it again, but quantum dot technology for the future is kind of interesting because quantum dot is tunable essentially, so you can kind of pick where your primaries lie. But there are other issues with Rec 2020, and it's one of those things where even if we can do it, we may want to avoid it because again, those narrow peaks that are typically required in the SPD and the spectral power distribution of the light source to hit that. As you get those narrower and narrower, you tend to have more metamerism issues, observer metamerism issues. So we start to see things more differently. So you'll see that even some of the laser projector manufacturers will purposefully widen out the bandwidth of those emissions to cause less metamerism issues, and also to deal with issues like speckle and other stuff. But yeah, it's one of those things that even if you can, maybe you shouldn't. So
yeah, and basically the professional deliverable is within that P3 container, right? So if your display can I think what you're looking for are displays that can recognize the Rec 2020 with the P3 boundary inside of it, and distinguish that signal and then give it back to you properly is basically what we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, having the settings in there, I mean, that's why when people are like, which workflow is best, we try to kind of stay agnostic there and say, look, if you want to work and output Rec, have your configuration set up for Rec 2020, that's fine. Put the monitor in Rec 2020. We have Rec 2020 modes on our monitor. But we do see a lot of people just setting the monitor to P3 and having their color management workflow set up to define things as P3 code values. So.
Yeah, exactly. Cullen, do you have anything else here, or should we go ahead and jump to some questions that were sent in?
I want to hear the answers to those questions that we got, man.
Okay. And are you seeing my screen at this point or not?
Yes.
Yep,
you are. Oh, so we're seeing all right, that's not good. All right. Nope, that's not good. There we go. You see that now. All right. So Chris D, if you're in the room, raise your hand and I'll pull you into this conversation. I won't use your last name unless you're in the room. And his question is, or her, don't know quite. How do we get from Resolve to an HDR viewing display, including, and this to me is the key point, sending the HDR tag to consumer displays? Let's start there.
All right. So I'll start with the easy answer. In the professional monitoring environment, you are just sending, again, RGB triplets over an SDI signal, and you put the monitor in the correct color gamut EOTF settings, and you'll get a correct display. We don't deal with metadata on the SDI output. We don't have to trigger any HDR flags. So that part is easy. In terms of the consumer setup, honestly, I'm not the consumer TV guy, and I'd hate to be the one providing the specific advice on how to trigger those things. There are standalone devices that can insert HDR metadata. There are grading systems that can include HDR metadata on output. But again, that's not really my world so much, because everything we make has SDI inputs, and on our HDR mastering displays, for example, you're not doing any tone mapping, right? You just go to the hard clip point that the display is capable of. And we get that similar question with people saying, well, I've got a 3000 nit monitor from you, but I'm only doing 1000 nit deliverable. What do I change on the monitor so that I don't get over 1000? And the answer is nothing. You don't send it over 1000 because that PQ EOTF is absolute. So there's nothing else you need to do. You just need to limit, if you want to, you can make it hard clip from your grading system. Most grading systems allow you to set up a color management workflow that will prevent code values over 1000 nits from being sent over the wire. If you don't do that, you can push it further, and you could check things on your scope and whatnot. But in theory, you should be able to limit that at the grading side of the equation.
Great. And I'll go ahead and share again. And this is getting a little clunky. Here we go. Does resolution matter in the grading suite, specifically 8K versus 4K? Everyone seems to be grading at 4K. Why is that? And I'll follow that up with Chris's observation that his company is investing in 8K in their gallery locations, and for reasons that are now obvious, they have concerns about finishing at 4K if they'll be displaying it at 8K. And then he attached a PDF, which we'll get to in a moment, but let's deal with that 4K versus 8K question up front.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you guys feel free to chime in, but my opinion on that is that when it comes to grading in general, the resolution isn't of paramount importance. You know, accurate color tracking is going to be more important, and then you also have to think about realistically what your viewing distance is to the grading display. Can you actually see the difference? And then, extremely importantly, when this question comes up, is the question of what are your trade-offs? How much more are you going to pay for an 8K display? In a lot of cases, a lot of the 8K displays, in terms of color off-axis viewing and other performance benchmarks, are kind of garbage. So you get lots of resolution, but everything else gets worse. So you can be kind of counterproductive there. I think the caveat there is if you're doing heavy VFX work, if you're doing rotoscoping, I'm not going to be the one to tell you, yeah, don't do things natively. There are applications where you want that, but you probably don't need a grading quality display for that sort of work either. You know, in VFX, you might just want a really nice computer monitor and use that. But for general grading, I think resolution is probably one of the least important aspects. I think all the other aspects of display performance are going to be paramount to just the resolution.
Yeah, Colin?
Yeah, no, I mean, my 2 cents, I would completely agree. And I think sort of similar to what we were just talking about with Rec 2020, for example, there's all kinds of value prop to be made for acquiring and operating in a gamut as large or larger than Rec 2020, and perhaps less of one to be made for like the dramatic benefits and the, you know, how worthy the trade-offs are to like displaying a gamut of that scale. And I think even more so the case for resolution. Like, yeah, capturing high res is great. Working in high res is great and can have all kinds of benefits. You know, like clicking up from 4K to 8K, as my friend Steve Yedlin, ASC, did a really, really good demo on a couple of years ago now. Those trade-offs can be, and to some extent, measure when you control the variables that Bram is talking about, of like how close are you to the screen and how important is off-axis viewing and stuff. It's the value prop is far from, you know, like cut and drive, like, oh, of course you would want 8K over 4K. You know, it's very much depends on your application, I think.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The 8K discussion I always find interesting because, you know, the BBC, you know, early on, they said you didn't need a bigger than 50-inch monitor, that there was no technical reason why anyone would ever want a monitor any bigger than 50 inches. And then they came back like 4 years later and said, yeah, okay, we were wrong about that, because clearly everyone likes really big displays. And what they found is the advantage why large displays are immersive has nothing to do with detail resolution. It has to do with filling your field of view. And so immersion is about getting out to your peripheral vision. And that's what, you know, 4K displays can get you at 60, 70, 80 inches, right? And if you're sitting 10 feet away from the TV, which is kind of what the average household distance is, the perception of the difference between HD and 4K, you need to be like 3 feet away from that display in order to actually see the visual difference to it. And when you're 10 feet away, you're not even close. So I think, to my mind, the value of 8K is largely make it bigger and not have those pixels really stand out at you at those really super huge sizes, right? The other point I'd make for this particular member is, if you are working like in a museum installation, I don't know if they're in a museum, but I know Robbie Carmen, MixingLight co-founder, does a lot of work for museums out of DC. And they will typically, they know exactly what displays are going in. And he was on 4K very early on because museums are very early adopters of these large format images for reasons we just discussed, immersion. And he would have them ship it to him. So that, yeah, he's grading on his, at that time, probably HD display, but he could do a confidence check on the actual model of display that they would have in the museum to make sure that he wasn't doing anything that would overdrive these things or create any problems in the space. So if you've got that kind of control where you know specifically what display you're using in your space, unlike most of us where we have no control over the end user and what they're looking on. In that particular situation, you kind of have a leg up where you can work in that 4K environment on that 8K material and have your confidence check right there in the room next to you, and not worry about it. So that would be kind of my little 2 cents on that particular question.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those. The specific situation that this person called out is an exception to the normal rule of not grading to a specific display. If you're grading material that's specifically going to be shown on a display at a gallery, then
Yeah.
there's a lot of value in looking at it on that display. It definitely bucks the trend of wanting to grade kind of more to as neutral reference grade of a display as possible to start from the middle ground.
Yep. All right, let's move on to our next question here. Chris J., if you're in the room, feel free to raise your hand and I'll pull you into this conversation. Chris is building out a new post suite and they're finally upgrading a BM230 to a newer model this year, like the DM241. But should I change the dynamic in my room with a larger format XM551U or XM651U and color on the client? I do have the space. Bram, how are your clients feeling about, going that route, with these larger displays?
I mean, it's not something we've seen everywhere, but we've definitely seen a huge growing trend towards using a single monitor in a suite when possible. It definitely removes the discussion of which display is right, because invariably these days, if you're using a 65-inch monitor and a 24-inch monitor in the same room, they're probably not going to be the same technology. So even if they measure the same, we all know that they'll probably look a little different. So grading on a single display is useful. So I do think that is a very viable workflow and something I'd recommend if your space will work out that way. I tell you guys it's not officially announced, but it's a good time as any to let the cat out of the bag that the 551U and 651U are about to be replaced. That official announcement will come in a couple of weeks. So there'll be a 552U and a 652U. Very similar specs, but these are using the newer WOLED panels that are deuterium based, and those have improved stability and lifespan, and that also translates into them being a little less prone to burn in over time. So we're looking forward to getting those out in the market. This is basically our third generation of WOLED panels that we will be using, and we still don't really recommend them for full-on HDR mastering. If you're doing an HDR deliverable to Netflix, we wouldn't promote this as the solution. But if you want to do HDR monitoring on it, you certainly can. It gets relatively bright. And again, there are some performance benefits over the previous generation. And we already had a lot of people using 551s and 651s for SDR mastering environments. So these new units will be even more up to the task.
Yeah, it's really interesting using these, and if you're largely still delivering, 709 images, these displays are fantastic. I mean, they are literally dream machines, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it's funny too, like on the HDR front, like we're definitely try not to oversell it, but we have a lot of people who use them as client monitors for HDR playback as well. So that's something just to keep in mind on those. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a good space for those. And again, we're probably just a couple weeks or so away from announcing those. Given what supply chains have been like in the last 18 to 24 months or so, we kind of wanted to get one announced that we could say, hey, it's shipping right now.
Yeah, it's no longer good enough that they say it's at the docks. Like that's not good enough to say it's shipping yet, right? It's like,
that's cool. Except that when the docks are backed up weeks, or when customs is closed for a month, or it's been fun making things.
Now, when you say stability, it has better stability. What do you mean exactly by better stability?
Well, so not to get too techie on it, but the key takeaway from the newer WOLED panels that are being manufactured these days is that they replace the hydrogen compounds with the deuterium compounds in the OLED material. And deuterium's it's an isotope of hydrogen, but the main thing is that it doesn't age at quite the same rate. So because it doesn't age as quickly, that's what gives you that additional stability. the O in OLED stands for organic, right? So what you have is you have this uneven aging of the color channels over time as you use the display. And because it's more stable, you have less of that aging over time. It's a more nuanced kind of change over time. And that also, again, benefits you in terms of burn-in, because burn-in ultimately is caused by that differential in aging between pixels. So those are the kind of high level benefits of this new technology. Again, don't want to oversell it. OLEDs, if you want to, you can burn one in, trust me. But they should be a marked improvement over the previous generation.
And Chris Johnston is with us. He asked that original question, and there's another part there. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and jump in?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to know, what's the life expectancy on this newer model that's coming out?
So they were still kind of rating them at 30,000 hours of use, and that's the thing with panel lifetime ratings that's kind of tricky is that nobody rates a panel for lifespan till they're dead. They all rate them to half light output, and the thing is that half light output still gets you well past where you need to be for the display to still be usable for SDR, right? Because these are marketed as HDR consumer displays that can get quite bright. But 30,000 hours is kind of what most technologies these days are being rated for. Some are longer, some are a hair shorter. Typically, when panel technologies are very new, sometimes you'll see that one of the limitations to getting some new technologies out to market is usually make the blue channel last longer. So you may see something that comes to market and only does 15 or 20 or 25,000 hours, but 30,000 hours is kind of a safe bet. Now, the important thing to remember there too is that light output's not the only thing you care about. If you use an OLED long enough, you'll start to see that you'll have your uniformity on WOLEDs is kind of interesting because it actually improves with use for a while, and then it will get worse as it nears the kind of end of life. But it's kind of counterintuitive compared to some other technologies in that that's why you see people want to break in their OLED panels and whatnot, because they'll actually again, that uniformity will improve through use. So it's not just about aging; it's also about what the panel does as it ages. Does uniformity get worse? Do you burn it in because you have the same logo come up all the time? So those are other considerations that might affect the usable lifespan of the unit.
Along those lines, Bram, if I'm feeding black into my display, but I just kind of keep it on all the time, those hours count, yes or no?
No, again, well, it depends on the technology, right? So if you're using, we don't sell it anymore, but if we're using an XM311K, then yes, it will affect the lifespan because that is a dual layer panel. So if anybody owns any other dual layer panels, there are several from competitors of ours, and you're just feeding it black, that does not mean the backlight turns off. And the backlight's always on at max brightness, essentially. So you really are aging that unit a lot by keeping it on. So those I would turn off if at all possible, if you own any of those dual layer or LMCL, as they're properly called, technologies. You want to turn those off when not using them. OLEDs, not really. You can put them, feed them black, and you're good. I still would probably recommend turning it off simply because it's too easy for your computer to reboot or your Blackmagic card to freak out one day, and then you get a static image of noise or something on the screen, and you end up burning it and ruining a display that way. So safe bet is to turn it off. But yeah, with OLED, in theory, if you're just feeding it black, you're not going to see any significant aging.
Chris, did we get your questions answered? Do you have anything else there for Bram?
I think so. Yeah. Let's see here. Oh, my BM230 is going in for calibration right now, and I'm on my DM170 just in the meantime. But how long is that DM170 rated for, like as far as expectancy?
Yeah, I mean, again, at least 30,000 hours. Those should last even longer because that's kind of their half light output rating, but they do like 450 nits or so new. So you're looking at 200 something nits at that, and you're probably only using it at 100 nits if you have it set up to default and SMPTE spec of 100 nits peak luminance. So that will last quite a while. with most panel technologies, especially non-OLED panel technologies, I tend to tell people that the display will probably last longer than you want to use it. It's usually, the way that panel technology evolves and stuff, there are some pretty significant changes over time that make people eager to change, whether that's wider color gamut or higher contrast or whatever it may be. So,
Thank you.
no problem.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you emailing in. And let's jump. We have one more question here, and then we'll open it up to the studio audience. Lonnie L., if you're in the room, feel free to raise your hand. They have a 6-year-old i1 display meter. Can they use it for Autocal? Bram, first, mention what Autocal is, because it's a really neat feature. And then talk to us about what you think, if that i1 display is still useful.
Sure. Yeah. So Autocal is something that we built for DM series and also for the XM310K, and our new XM312U will feature it as well. Why DM series? Well, because DM series have a USB port on them. That's the main reason we don't have it on, for example, an AM series or an older LM series. But the basic premise is that you take a probe that has a correct matrix stored on it and allows you to plug directly into the monitor. The monitor generates all the test patterns for you, and it does a full Autocal. Now, what's neat about this Autocal process is we're profiling the native behavior of the display. And then as you select any color space, color temperature, or EOTF combination on the monitor, it will generate a LUT for that combination on the fly based on that native profile data. So for example, if I select Rec 709, Gamma 24, 6500K white balance, it builds a LUT and it loads it to the monitor. It takes about 10 seconds to build the LUT from that profile data. So every time you switch, it takes about 10 seconds, but it only takes 10 seconds the first time. Once that LUT has been generated and built and saved to the monitor, you don't have to regenerate it until you do a new Autocal. We don't build LUTs for every possible EOTF combination because there's some stuff you're unlikely to use, like for example, gamma 1.8, P3 gamuts, and 9300K. That combination is probably not going to be used, so we don't bother building the LUT because it would take 10 seconds for each one of those wacky combinations. But if you ever need that wacky combination, guess what? It's there. So the important thing also about Autocal is just one of several options. It does not exclude the possibility to use options that people may prefer. So someone may want to build something with color space. Someone may want to build something with an old light space license they have. Somebody may want to build something with CalMan. Our system still allows you to profile the monitor, build LUTs, and load them to the monitor manually that way as well. We want to make sure that when we do things that evolve kind of the color management options on our display, that we remain relatively open platform. We want this to be something that's flexible for whatever the needs are of a facility. And that's really important if you want to do like something custom, especially, right? So if you want to do like native primaries of the monitor with some certain EOTF. And I know that's probably not what's going to happen here among most colorists, but there are educational facilities, there are colleges, there are universities that want to do this sort of research and need to be able to build in custom things. And you can do that on all these displays. Or if you just prefer to use those programs, absolutely 100% can do that. The main kind of driving force behind Autocal is we want to provide something that was simpler for end users to use. You didn't have to become an expert at calibration, and calibration was such a daunting task for a lot of people that people were sending in monitors to us and having us calibrate. Still happy to do that too, by the way, but for less than the cost of shipping both ways, you can buy an i1 from us with that custom firmware. As far as i1s that's 6 years old, as long as you bought it from us and it is an OEM version of the i1 probe, then yes, that will still work. You should send it in to us for a firmware update, and we do need to create the custom matrices for it and load it into the probe. that was the key thing that we worked on with X-Rite. Is X-Rite doesn't natively, normally on an i1, have built-in memory on the probe that is accessible for matrix creation. They actually helped us create a custom matrix version that took advantage of some free flash storage on this device to allow us to load custom matrices to it. So we're grateful to them for doing it because it allows us to have a more affordable probe option. But this also works with the CR100, with the K10A, and a number of other probes. But the Autocal with the i1, the reason it has to be an OEM is because that's the only ones that can be upgraded with the flash storage. And the reason it has to be one you bought from us is not because we're trying to, get that $280 from you. This is mostly a service type thing that we're offering as a convenience feature to help us sell monitors. The main reason is just license restriction from X-Rite. We can't upgrade something that wasn't purchased from us. The other thing is, if it's 6 years old and you have one, and even if you did buy it from us, you may want to consider buying a new one anyway. They do age over time. And the other thing is, by the time you ship it to us, you've already eaten up a lot of costs. So buying a brand new one, $280, is probably the simplest thing to do. It's what a lot of people do. But if you do have one you bought before we offered Autocal and it is the OEM model, by all means send it in. We'll upgrade it for free, and we will load the matrices on it. We cannot remotely upgrade them. This is something that we've been asked by people who own Spectros. Again, per license agreement with X-Rite, we're only authorized to update them in our Belgian office, our US office, and our Shenzhen office.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, I've got several of those i1 displays. I'm not sure I have I'm not sure that I have an OEM version of it. Does the OEM version work with the like CalMan or Color Space? It does?
Yeah, so that's the other important thing is it won't work with X-Rite's retail software like i1 Display Profiler or anything like that. But these probes will fully work with Color Space and with CalMan and with Lightspace.
Okay,
the one thing to remember, though, is that those programs don't take advantage of our built-in matrix storage. So we still have to provide you an external matrix file that matches the one that we store on. So you can load that in software.
And you just punch it in. You'll punch in the numbers manually.
Punch in the numbers, or in the case of Color Space, it would be the builder probe files, and you just load those in. But we're happy to provide that for you. Again, there's no extra charge for that, and that's a valuable thing too, because a lot of our Autocal users might still want to use Color Space to, for example, or CalMan to do a quality control check of the Autocal calibration. We're all in favor of that as well. It's usually the portion of taking the profile, building a LUT, loading it to the user or to the user memories on the monitor that are the more daunting process. The actual doing a quick QC check, more people seem comfortable with that. So it can be a good combination to use Autocal and still do all your quality control checking in CalMan or in Color Space.
Yeah, and you might need CalMan or Color Space simply to generate the monitor report that you then send in with your Dolby Vision Master.
100%,
right?
yeah.
Because they're going to want that information, even though you used Autocal to do the actual calibration.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the convenience of Autocal is a little bit being able to generate all these different combinations on the fly, especially you can imagine people on set who might, quickly need to change to something else. They have the ability to, if they're told they need to monitor a wide gamut or whatever, they can quickly switch to those profiles as needed.
Now I'm getting ready to redo our calibration series on MixingLight that I did a couple of years ago. That one's completely out of date now in terms of the software that it features. But one of the things I remember from when I did that series is I had an old i1 display and then I had a new one. And after about 4 years, that i1 display, it's a colorimeter, which means it's plastic filters, and those do start aging. And I found that after about 4 years, I got to the point where I just couldn't put in an offset that was able to adjust for it. And Bram, you're right. Is it 250 now for an OEM version?
280 from us. And again, we're happy to upgrade them, but if you want to buy a new one, that's great too. Either way works for us. It's just you have to do the math sometimes on whether it's worth it to send in an old one, especially if it's 6, 7, 8 years old. So
yeah, and I would say at that point you just buy a new one because you're probably going to get better results from it anyway.
Yeah.
because you'll have to do less adjustment, and it'll work much more cleanly throughout the entire grayscale, which is really what you want off that colorimeter. And Bram, a little bit off topic, and then we'll go back to the final question that I have prepared. Someone was asking, you've got the DM series, the BM series, the XM series.
Yeah.
How does that naming go? Like, is there a scheme there?
So to be fair, it's kind of evolved over time, but basically our BM series is a little bit older of a hardware platform. Does not have the USB port built into it for the Autocal. DM series are going to have the more sophisticated hardware, more powerful FPGA that enables things like live grade communication. It's going to enable things like the image flip capabilities. It's real popular for on-set use because of that. So those are both HD series of monitors. Again, DM is going to be a lot more feature rich and have the Autocal capability with the USB port built into it. The BM series is really dedicated more towards editorial control room type applications, things where you maybe aren't color grading necessarily, but where you still need accurate and stable monitoring. DM series we really intend to be more for those more color critical applications. DM series will essentially be wide gamut, 10-bit, and be more feature rich. XM series is essentially anything that's UHD or 4K resolution. So those run on a different platform that require different FPGAs. But the real difference, obviously there are certain panel type pairings that make sense in those different series. For example, you probably won't ever see an 8-bit DM, I would think, whereas you might see an 8-bit BM, although there are some 10-bit BMs as well. But the main thing there is just the hardware platforms that they're built on. So that's kind of what you're looking at there.
And I see that Lanny has raised his hand. Lanny, go ahead and unmute yourself. Lanny asked the question, the previous question that we were just talking about Autocal and the display, the I1 display.
I mean, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My main question, actually, which I guess that you just haven't gotten to yet, was if I purchase one of these I1 probes from you, and I need to get my DM240 sent to you to recalibrate, is there any advantage to me doing that at the same time? Like you can then calibrate the probe to that exact monitor, and is that better?
Yeah, we're happy to do that, and on this very theoretical, scientific level, that should marginally be better. But in practice, it doesn't really matter. You should be able to get just fine results if we just do it on the same SPD. So, but yeah, if you want us to match to your exact unit, especially if it's a much older monitor, but you'd be talking about something where there been significant shift in the SPD over time due to aging, to where you'd have any sort of appreciable measurable benefit to doing it on your really old monitor versus a new version of it. But there's no problem in doing it that way, and we're happy to match to your specific monitor if you want the matrix built that way. We've got to do the work either way, so it doesn't matter what we do the work on.
Okay. I just have one last thing for you, because
Sure.
You were talking about how the Autocal, you kept going on, you can do all these different crazy custom, this gamma with that or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was under the impression it will take the place of sending in your monitor every year for recalibration. That's still the case, right? Or
Yeah, you wouldn't have to send it back into us because you could do it in-house. I would recommend, and it's probably an important point that we haven't touched on. Doesn't matter whether you own a K10A, that's like a $7,000 probe, a CR100 that's around $6,000, or if it's an I1 that's $300. We'd probably recommend sending the probe to us every year to have the probe recalibrated. So it doesn't eliminate the need to send stuff in, but it does mean you're not not working on your monitor, which I think is a lot more convenient. But probes drift just like monitors drift. The filters age over time is the main cause of that. But there are other elements that can change over time that way too complicated to get into. But it is a good idea to send those probes back to us at a relatively regular interval. If you have the higher end probes, like if you have a CR100, those don't really drift very quickly, so maybe a year is overkill. But if you want to send it in, again, we calibrate the probe for free for any of our customers, so the cost is just the shipping for you, and that's about it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, Lanny. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for sending us the question. We greatly appreciate it. And Tony Salgado, we're going to run a couple minutes long here if Cullen and Bram are okay with that.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Good. All right, Tony Salgado, you've had your hand up since the start. What do you want to talk about?
I just had some quick questions to Bram. Real quick, I've been a long time FSI monitor user. I've got my legacy 2461W to the right of me.
Yeah.
And it's still going strong. It's approaching 10 years, and I got to compliment the company as far as I've had it calibrated last year. It exceptionally matches my LG CX, which is amazing, and SDR. But if any of those who are considering getting calibration done because they offer it for free, it's one of the great services that you offer. No other company I know does that. That's the one reason I went with your company. And here I am 10 years later, and I'm still using it until it blows up.
Yeah.
Two quick questions for you is the first one is the volumetric collapse issue that you mentioned earlier. Is that a potential problem when viewing on LG CX OLEDs in SDR, or is that strictly reserved for HDR mode?
So the short answer there is that they don't exhibit any sort of appreciable volumetric collapse in SDR mode. If you keep yourself at reference SDR SMPTE levels, which is 100 nits plus minus 5 nits, then they will not exhibit that. Now, it's not because they are, a lot of people mistakenly think that they operate as additive displays. They are purely additive displays. They don't. The thing is that they mimic additive behavior extraordinarily well below, I think it's about 150, 200 nits or so. So if you keep yourself below those thresholds, which conveniently our SDR mastering levels are in this industry, then they really don't exhibit that. There are other nuances you may want to consider in terms of colorimeter calibration for those, because they are non-additive. So you get things like the Bodner method, you get things like color spaces, volumetric probe matching that can have some small appreciable benefit. So those are things that are certainly worth considering if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of calibrating those WOLED displays. But short answer is no, the volumetric collapse is really something that happens primarily in HDR usage.
Perfect. And then the next question I have real quick is, so I'm looking now to replace ancient legacy 2461 with an HDR monitor, and I've tested it. I got a first-hand look even before they were really released. It's the Sony X1800 and 2400 series, and also the small HD Vision 17 HDR monitor.
Sure.
Each has their pros and cons. I don't have time to go into right now, but what really attracted me to either of them is the Sony up to the 24-inch. They also have a 32-inch, but the 2400 model is in the $10,000 range. The small HD was a little over 10,000, but it's a 17-inch. But in either case, my main question is, does FSI have any plans in the near future to produce a monitor, an HDR monitor, that's capable of 1,000 nits in approximately the 24-inch size, and around the 10,000, 12,000 price range, or maybe even below? Or is that just technologically at this point not possible for your company?
Yeah, so I think this goes back a little bit to this sometimes not chasing the low-hanging fruit, which may make us some money, but which we at some fundamental level are morally opposed to. but yes, we have plans to release a lot of new stuff. Now, a lot of stuff has been delayed by just not being able to get parts as quickly as we want to get them. We know there's a desire for that. I really hate to call out specific other companies, so I'll try to keep this general, but a global dimming solution is not appropriate for a mastering environment. Maybe on set if you need a quick and dirty HDR preview, but there are other ways to do that. But I think spending 10K plus on something where the entire backlight is dimming, not zoned, but you have entire backlight dimming, that's not real HDR. At any given point on a display like that, you have a static contrast ratio of 1,000 to 1, and that's it. So you can either see your highlights or you can see your lowlights, but guess what? You're not going to see them at the same time. So we don't think that that is kind of a legit approach to this challenge, and it's not something we have plans on trying to chase. Then when it comes to full array local dimming backlights, full array local dimming, we are all in on that technology, obviously, with the XM312U and previously the XM310K. If you need to get to well above 1,000 nits, it is the only way you're going to do that in this day and age. So 312U, we're doing everything we can to make a full array local dimming monitor as best as we can. We've tried to keep the prices as reasonable as we can by keeping it at $22,000. And it's going to be one of the brightest displays that you can get for HDR mastering. That being said, there are trade-offs with full array local dimming. If you give me any full array local dimming monitor on the market, I can throw test patterns on there that will break it. It'll break its performance, show its weaknesses. And those are trade-offs that you have to know. You have to know how to work around them. You have to understand them. Where I think that we as a company are kind of drawing a line is that we think the full array local dimming backlight trade-offs, the kind of Achilles heels of those, multiple Achilles heels of those, is worth it is if you can get well above 1,000 nits. But if you only need to do 1,000 nits, then there are so many technologies that are on the cusp of getting us to 1,000 nits without having to be full array local dimming that we think that maybe those would be better solutions. So like OLED monitors, for example, are starting to get brighter and brighter, right? So you have displays that are doing 540 nits already, and the roadmaps from these semiconductor companies, when you talk to them, when these panel providers, is hey, yeah, we'll do 700 next year, and we'll do 1,000 the year after that. Or even shorter term on the larger scale with something like QD-OLED. QD-OLED will do 1,500 nits peak. It will do 1,000 nits in over a 10% area. And those aren't going to be terribly expensive either. So we think if 1,000 nits is what you need, maybe full array local dimming isn't the premier technology. So that's why we've been reluctant to try to go into that space, because there are trade-offs, and we know those trade-offs better than anybody because we sold a fair number of XM310Ks for those mastering suites that needed to do those brighter deliverables. So yeah, that's kind of our mentality and what's guiding us. So if we do something like what you're describing, Tony, it would probably be significantly brighter. Those price points are certainly things we have in mind and we know people want, but I don't think we'd settle for 1,000 nits. I think we'd probably want to go a lot brighter.
Thank you so much. I'm going to reach out to you via email to give you
Sounds good.
Some private feedback regarding some of this testing I did with those two other brands, because you brought up clearly some issues I discovered too, but I don't want to talk about it there. So I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about you, Bram, and Flanders Scientific in general is that you guys are so approachable. I mean, I get people asking me questions about FSI displays and products, and I'm like, call them. They actually answer the phone and they actually give you human responses, which is a really nice thing.
Sure.
And then now I'm going to jump over to Peter Morgenthaler, one of our contributors who's on the call today. He's got his hand raised. Peter, what's on your mind?
Hey guys, hey Bram.
Hello, Peter.
Good to see you at NAB. That was nice to have in-person meetings.
I do. I almost didn't think it was going to happen, but I'm glad we're there. And for those of you who are planning on going to trade shows, just quick plug that we'll be at Cinegear, we'll be at IBC, we'll be at the SempTech conference. So come see us at those things.
Well, I'm hoping to see you at IBC again this year. So
Fantastic.
I miss Amsterdam in September.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm still rocking my CM250.
Sure.
I think it was one of the first ones that kind of rolled off the line in 2014, and it's still an amazing monitor for me. It's been definitely the best monitor that I've ever owned, and I'm not doing a lot of HDR, so it's still working great for the purposes that I need.
Yeah.
But I recently built a grading theater, a projection theater, with a friend of mine, and we've got that set up for P3 gamma 2.6 projection. But I'm starting to wonder about the CM250 in terms of being able to check those grades. If I put it into P3 mode and put it into gamma 2.6, what can I expect to see on a top emission OLED as far as P3 coverage?
Yeah, I'm always really reluctant to recommend any flat panel display for previewing things that are going to be shown in a projection type environment. Perceptually, there's a huge difference between an emissive display and something that's reflective. There's also it's hard to put into words, but it's difficult to compare something that's occupying such a huge field of view to something that's not, and to something that's operating at such different nit levels. Traditionally, our advice has been, and this is not quite what you were asking, but for people who said, hey, I don't have access to a projector, what do I do if I need to do theatrical deliverable? We would say grade everything in Rec 709, then basically containerize it as P3. And that's the way to do it. And you should, because those LUTs are pretty well defined, you should have something that tracks very much with the kind of perceptual feeling that you had when you were grading in Rec 709. Now, if you're talking about you're going to do your primary work in a grading theater and you just want to do QC checks of digital cinema deliverables, we have people do that all the time on OLEDs, and you can certainly do that. The one thing that's going to be kind of weird is whether you want to, or the question you have to ask yourself is whether you want to actually set the peak luminance at 48 nits or keep it at 100. 48 nits on an OLED to me just always looks wrong. So that would be the one thing. But technically, they can be put in that mode. You can get them down to 48 nits peak, and you can certainly put them in P3 and gamma 2.6. It's a good way to check that colors aren't wacky. Again, we have people who would do this to actually check their DCPs when they couldn't occupy the grading theater, and it's good for those type of QC work type scenarios. I certainly wouldn't start grading in a theater, then bounce to the CM250, then bounce back to the theater. You're going to drive yourself mad chasing ghosts,
Yeah, and you nailed the use case that I'm running into is that that theater is getting pretty busy, and just as far as QCing those cinema deliverables, I just wanted to see if I could see accurate P3 color on the CM250 just to kind of double check.
It'll do something like 98, 99% of the gamut coverage. As close as is not going to make much of a difference. And then you can certainly set all the other parameters to match in terms of the EOTF and everything else. So that's certainly something that will work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. 48 nits at 24 inches is not the same as 48 nits at 16 feet.
No, so. It's not. That's why I keep telling people about this, the new Barco light steering projector installs that they're planning on doing at 300 nits. And people are like, oh, that's not that bright. It's in a dark theater with that much field of view, you best believe it's bright.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's the answer that I need to the question. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. And there's a question here from Martin about Bram. How do you measure how much a probe has drifted, and how do you know that that device hasn't drifted? I will be. It's funny
I love
question.
This question so much.
Me too. Because
this question is it tugs at my heartstrings. So there's a couple things here. One is that we use ultimately reference spectroradiometers here to calibrate all of our colorimeters, and we actually regularly recalibrate our colorimeters. So our team, what they'll typically do is when we get a new shipment of monitors in, they'll actually just recalibrate, do a fresh calibration of our colorimeter radiometers that we use, which is a mix of Minolta CA310s and CR100s from colorimetry research, and then occasionally some Klein probes as well. But we just redo those regularly so that we know that the colorimeter hasn't drifted or broken by being dropped on the ground. And then those spectroradiometers, we have a regular set schedule to where we send them in to be recertified against a reference lamp by colorimetry research. We actually, in the US, we send our probes to colorimetry research because they're over in Santa Clarita, and it's just easier to have them do it. In Europe, actually, we are the recalibration point for colorimetry research. So in that office, we actually have our own reference lamp and the equipment to recertify probes there, to recalibrate spectros there. Now, in terms of sanity checks in the interim, our European office has the benefit of having the reference equipment so they can do it. But what we do is we have multiple spectros and we actually check them against each other. And if we see a deviation, that's how we know that one of them is broken. And it doesn't happen often, but we've had situations where, either a probe got, thrown on the ground or something like that, and something happens to it, or, there's been a mechanical failure of some sort on those. So we check them that way. We also have a wavelength check device here. This is way more boring than you guys would care about, but we have something that has a reference.
I love it, actually. This actually gets to the, I don't know. I love this stuff. So I'm going to let you go on for another minute about how you do this.
So there's the most likely thing to happen to a spectro is that if you drop it on the ground, the diffraction grating will actually move or be damaged. And there's a way you can use a reference light source that has a known peak emission at a certain wavelength. And you can basically measure that, and you can see if it's measuring that known wavelength where it's supposed to be. And if it's not, it will fail the wavelength check, and your spectro is busted. Now, that's not a full calibration, but it's a great way to check the calibration. So we do the wavelength checks, and we check our probes against each other is how we do that. And then we send them in regular intervals to make sure that they're still accurate. And we're also relatively picky about how close our spectros match each other. So we'll typically send them in around the same time and ask the people at CRI to make sure that our spectros agree within, very tight tolerances of one another, because, the normal spectro spec, even from very high-end ones, is usually that, plus minus 0.0015 or so agreement in XY chromaticity. We like ours to agree better than that. So,
here's what makes me laugh about all of this. As someone who, through Mixing Light, Robbie got me into this whole thing. And so I've got, in the other room there, I've got the CR100, and great colorimeter, but it's a colorimeter, right? So it needs to be measured from time to time, and offsets need to be applied from time to time. And so then we picked up a CR200 or 250. And so I've got that, which is the spectro, so that I can measure the offset and recalibrate. And the reason you go with that is because the spectro reads too slow, right? So if you're reading, at the time we'd be reading, a couple thousand patches, it would take 5 times as long on the spectro than on the colorimeter. And so I remember the first time I was designing my first set of offsets for the CR100, the colorimeter. And so I go through the whole thing, and I hook up the spectro, and it takes 3 measurements: red, green, and blue. And then I pull up the
takes white.
White, right? 4 measurements on a device that's like $5,000 in order to calibrate a $3,000 device. And it takes 4 measurements, and that's how you combine. And that's all the spectro ever does. It takes those 4 freaking measurements, or the spectro, in order to calibrate the colorimeter. And I was like, "You're kidding me? We spent $5,000 for 4 tests?
Well,
that just seems crazy."
And it seems crazy, but it's also important to remember that, that's because the majority of displays are, again, RGB additive displays. So if you measure white, red, green, blue, you know how red behaves, you know how green behaves, you know how blue behaves, and you know that those should add up to white. So that's why, again, multi-point methods like the multi-point color space methodology for probe matching when you are using a WOLED, for example, or the Bodner method, which I think is supported in CalMan, offer some added accuracy when you're dealing with those technologies. But yeah, in general, yeah, you're absolutely right. The other thing to remember is that it's not just about speed, because sometimes people say, well, can I just use Spectro and be done with it for full profiling? But the other thing with Spectro is they're typically not as sensitive in the low lights. So, because they require, you're going through a really thin aperture on those, and you require a certain amount of photons to go through before you get an accurate reading. So low light sensitivity, unless you have a very expensive Spectro like a CS2000A or something like that, which is maybe 35-40 grand or something like that from Minolta, tend not to be super sensitive in the low lights either. And colorimeters are better at that because it's a simple photodiode based system, and those photodiodes tend to be a lot more sensitive to light coming in.
Cullen, before we wrap this up, any last words here? Any last thoughts? Any last questions for Bram?
I got to tell you, I feel like I've learned more about where we're at in terms of current display tech and the way that FSI does business and gets all these great monitors out there than I thought I was going to. So nothing further to add. Just thanks to Bram for sharing info with us today.
Sure, I appreciate it.
Yeah, Bram, thank you very much. I didn't realize we ran 23 minutes long, so I try to keep these things tight. But I get on, Bram, I get on, I just sit down with you and I can keep on going. So, and I could keep on going. We haven't talked about future tech. You just got back from, but we're not going to go there. We've run long enough, and maybe we'll have you on in the near future to talk about, maybe as a podcast, we'll talk about what's coming down the pike. So.
And I'm not going to read this question out loud, but I'm just going to answer him and he can think of that what he wills. But Darren, please stay tuned in the next couple of weeks. We'll have some news there for you.
Yeah, and speaking of the chat, there's been a lot of conversation on the chat.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just missed all that. I literally just saw this pop up, and I haven't read any of the other messages, so I apologize if I missed anybody. But also, don't be shy about reaching out to me. I do tend to get busy, but I'm happy to try to answer things via email. And if I steer you towards support, it's not because I'm trying to blow you off. It's because I think they'll probably do a better job answering than I will. But when it comes to technology questions, if you want to ever shoot the breeze about future technology, please don't hesitate to call me. That's what I love to do. So.
That and F1.
True.
And there were some good answers in the chat about how to kick off HDR in a consumer display. So what I'm going to do is when this call ends, I'm going to take a bunch of screenshots. When this goes up on Mixing Light sometime next week, I'll compile a bunch of those answers on that topic, and I'll put them in the post that's associated with this insight on Mixing Light. So stay tuned there. If you've been watching us on YouTube, I apologize for the mess up, and you probably started off on one stream and ended up on another. So for that reason, I'm going to leave this up on YouTube until the insight comes out next week, and then we'll take it off YouTube and it'll live on Mixing Light, so to make up for that mix-up. So for MixingLight.com, I'm Patrick Inhofer. We've got Colin Kelly who joined us. Thanks, Tony and Lanny and everyone else who joined us on this call. And of course, thank you, Bram Desmet, for sharing your thoughts and explaining this all to us, because we need some splaining. For MixingLight.com, I'm Patrick Inhofer, and see you next time.